Okay, I want to welcome you to the panel discussion on economics, class, and religion, interdisciplinary methodological approaches. This event is being co-sponsored by the Harvard Divinity School and the Project on Religion, Political Economy, and Society at the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs. My name is Rachel McClary, and I direct the Project on Religion, Political Economy, and Society. I will be your moderator today. I want to extend my appreciation to Dean William Graham for hosting the event here at the Harvard Divinity School. He was to be the moderator, but a higher authority summoned him to a meeting, and so I'm hoping that he'll make it later to the discussion. Before getting started with what promises to be an engaging exchange of ideas, I would also like to thank Provost Stephen Hyman and his office for funding this event. The Provost is also funding another co-sponsored event on February 23rd on the Secular City Revisited, a conference commemorating the 40th anniversary of the publication of Harvey Cox's The Secular City. And I hope you'll join us for that event as well. Let me introduce to you in alphabetical order our panelists today. Our first panelist is Robert Barrow. He is Paul M. Warburg Professor of Economics in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. Anne Monius is Professor of South Asian Religions in the Harvard Divinity School. Robert Orsi is Charles Warren Professor of the History of Religion in America, the Divinity School, and Chair of the Committee on the Study of Religion in FAS. Amartya Sen is Lamont University Professor, and he holds appointments both in the economics and the philosophy departments. Christopher Winship is Professor of Sociology in FAS. The format of the discussion today will be as follows. The panelists were given a set of questions in advance for their consideration. Each panelist will have more or less 5 minutes to respond to each question. I wish to encourage an exchange among the panelists. We also welcome comments and questions from the audience. I only ask that your comment or your question be relevant to the issues that are under discussion. Okay. I kind of hate to proceed with Amartya, but I think we're going to have to. I'm sure he's going to be here very shortly. Okay, we'll proceed with the first question in alphabetical order. Okay. The first question is, in the development of the various social sciences over the past 75 to 150 years, the study of religion generally was viewed as a marginal topic of concern, except for anthropology, sociology, and psychology. Today, the study of religion is becoming a topic of intellectual inquiry of many disciplines, the domain of none. In 5 minutes or less, please describe for us your methodological approach to the study of religion. How does your understanding of what religion is factor into your choice of analytical framework? Robert.
So I'm relatively new to considering religion in my research, but I have thought for some time that religion must be an important force in thinking about the economic outcomes that I've been interested in, such as things like economic development. So I wanted just to say a little bit here about what we've been trying to do in terms of the research looking at the interplay between religion and political economy. So in the kind of analysis that we've been doing, we've thought about religion mattering for economic results through two kinds of channels. One involves formal participation in religious activities. So this could be group activities such as formal religious services, or it could be individual activities such as individual prayer. But the main special feature that we've been thinking about religion is not time spent on services, church attendance, and so on, but rather what comes out of it or other forces with respect to individual beliefs and values, in particular about how those beliefs and values matter for traits and characteristics that would be important for economic productivity. So I have in mind things like individual work ethic, thrift, honesty, the kind of forces that Max Weber focused on in his classic work about religion and political economy. So the basic framework that I'm thinking about here is that formal participation, such as religious services, thrift, etc., might be important for economic outcomes, but they work through the channel of altering individual beliefs and characteristics. And through that channel, they might then matter for economic results. It's possible that the formal activities also have some influence in the form of kind of social capital. This would be something about religious services functioning more or less akin to a social club. There might be some network effects there, other dimensions of social capital. But I think that dimension of religion would not be something really special that would distinguish religion from various other things that people consider. So I tend to think that it's probably less important. The analysis we've been doing also considers what the role is of the state, in particular the nature of interaction between state and religion, whether or not there's an official state religion, whether the government is doing things to regulate, subsidize, or suppress religion. Those are all things that might be important, but they'd be working through influencing formal participation and ultimately influencing the religious beliefs that we think matter ultimately for political economy. Now, the approach that we've been doing is quantitative, but maybe more to the point, analytical. More specifically, in terms of thinking about what are the connections between religion and political economy, been using various sources of data within an analytical framework. So some of the data are across countries, some are across regions of countries such as U.S. states, and some would be across individuals. In the cross-country context, particularly using survey data on individuals with respect to participation and religious beliefs, an example of that being the World Values Survey, which recently came out with an updated wave for 2001, which covers a lot more countries than the previous waves. So part of this analysis empirically is to try to estimate what are the effects of religion, whether participation or beliefs, on political and economic outcomes. In particular, what is the effect on economic growth? Can we separate the two-way causation that's important between religion and economic outcomes? And we've sort of been trying to do that, to sort that out as part of the empirical analysis. I should say this kind of empirical work is what in economics one would call positive analysis. It's something about if-then statements. If something happens with respect to the religion market or what the government is doing to religion, then we're trying to get estimates of what is the response in terms of the religion outcomes and ultimately in terms of economic activity. So it's a positive analysis in the economic sense. Now, of course, the results, if they turn out to be firmly established, may have some implications for policy, which is what economists would tend to call normative analysis. So, for example, there may be some implications from the results for things about the interaction between state and religion. So these would be policy implications in the form of, is it a good idea to have freedom of religion? What in general is the nature of the interaction between the state and the religion market? What is the case for having some kind of regulations, subsidy, suppression, etc.? The faith-based initiatives that President Bush had once proposed but seems to have forgotten about would be an example of this kind of thing that one might evaluate. But the general approach is to do the positive analysis first so that one has some serious basis for making some kind of policy implications, that is, for making normative judgments. So the main analysis thus far that we've been involved with is really on the positive side.
Anne?
I don't know how to preface this except perhaps now for something completely different. I have to also confess, and I won't belabor this, that the questions as posed, in a sense, represent spent a long time trying to figure out what I thought in my own terms and in my own field the question was really trying to get at, and trying to locate where I thought the question was leading me in a path where I stopped to recognize what I do in the study of religion. And in the first question, the issue to me was very clear in the phrasing of religion as the purview of the social sciences, now opened up to wider fields of inquiry. Because in my own training, and certainly thinking about what I do not locate myself in the social sciences. The study of religion for the past century plus has also been thoroughly located institutionally in the academy in the humanities. And that is very much where I see myself located. And given that, I would say that my overall methodology, if you will, or my intellectual patterns of inquiry, focus on the question of meaning. Where does meaning lie? How do we recover it? How does meaning and its appreciation then manifest itself in certain kinds of cultural and religious activities? In terms of methodology, my colleague, I'm indebted to my colleague Don Swearer, who last week suggested that perhaps better for us, rather than methodology, was research pattern. I like that idea very much. That in my own field, in my own subdiscipline, and in my own research, I work on medieval South Indian texts and religious practices. Basic questions. What did it actually mean to be Hindu? What did it mean to be Jain? What did it mean to be Buddhist? Are unanswered. They haven't even been asked in very interesting ways. Take a text, take any piece of historical evidence. Why was it produced? What was the intention behind the production? How was it received? What is the worldview being expressed here in basic terms? How could this have made sense to anyone with a rational mind? These are questions that occupy my time and that remain astoundingly in my own subdiscipline unanswered. There are scores of texts. We could fill this room with historical material that has never seen the light of analytic day in any way, shape, or form. And in my field right now, given the strong post-colonial critique of the way Hinduism, Indian religions had been studied, virtually every text we thought we understood has been questioned and reread. So, again, these are my central questions. Am I interested in what a text has to say in its own terms? Yes. Am I interested in the history of its reception, in commentary, in retelling? Yes. Am I interested in what inscriptional evidence might have to suggest about patterns of economic exchange and patronage that led to the flourishing of literary cultures? Yes. Am I interested in the role of textual production, literary culture, in wider social formations such as the temple or the mutta or the monastery? Yes. All of those questions, which in my mind ultimately impinge on the issue of meaning, on trying to figure out for human participants, after all, in the humanities we're talking about in religious studies what human beings hold most near and dear, most intimately and value most highly, ultimately demands a variety of methodologies, as I think the question assumes, as asked. Thanks.
Can I just interject here? I think this question was actually radically rewritten by Bill Graham. And I think that Anne's response is very appropriate in the way in which Bill Graham rewrote the question. I think he was trying to highlight the differences between a social science approach and other approaches to the study of religion. Bob?
Thank you. I actually also wanted to say something about the question, about the shape of the question. There are two things about the question. And then, I can go on and talk about my methodology and talk about the ways in which where I think the study of religion is as a discipline today, because one of the ways actually I dissent from the question is, well, this will be clear in a second. Anyway, so first, the first assumption of the question is that somehow the study of religion had, quote, nothing to do with the development of the social sciences. We I think, could talk about that a little bit, because I think it actually had everything to do with the development of the social sciences. And in fact, the religion problem, the problem of what to do with this domain of human existence and this way of human being and knowing, was fundamental to the emergence of modern epistemologies. Every sort of major thinker had a theory of religion that was at the foundation of his or her broader social understanding. So I think actually we would have to rephrase that and say that really, in the development of the social sciences over the past 75 to 150 years, religion has been, the problematic of religion has been fundamental. But it was this next sentence that caused me some dismay. I'll read the sentence, and then the sentence says, today the study of religion is becoming a topic of intellectual inquiry of many disciplines, the domain of none. Hello.
Hi.
Welcome.
Just
That is you.
Just checking who I was.
Would you like to introduce Professor Sen?
I wasn't. Professor Amartya Sen.
Thank you.
So today the domain of the study of religion is becoming a topic of intellectual inquiry of many disciplines, a domain of none. I've actually been worried. I think there are political questions that need to be asked about the fate of the study of religion right now, today, post 9/11. And I think that the claim that the study of religion has broken free from its disciplinary moorings and is now, quote, the domain of none, is a striking statement. I'm concerned. This is my anxiety. My anxiety right now is that there's a new set of agendas being driven precisely by policy makers, precisely by governments who are concerned with the social place of religion and political movements, by economic entities that are concerned about religion. These agendas are creating a new domain of religious inquiry called policy. And I think that is a very problematic development, and one that scholars in the discipline of religious studies have reason to be concerned about, because I think that is inviting us to make our knowledge and to bring our to put our knowledge at the service of other agendas and I'm very concerned about that. So, my own methodology is to study religion on the ground in what I think of as the messy networks of everyday life, including kinship and friendship and social relationships and so forth. A friend of mine once said to me, well, let me just say this a little bit more. I don't think that religious traditions, for example, how am I doing on time?
Go ahead.
Do I have a problem?
No, you're fine. You're fine.
Give me a sense of where I am. 2 minutes? 2 minutes? 2 minutes?
2 minutes.
The problem with a Weberian analysis, and we'll get to this later on in the questions, the problem with the Weberian analysis, and I don't think this was necessarily a problem with Weber, but a problem with Weberian analysis is the assumption that you can anatomize a religious tradition apart from its practices on the ground in people's experience and in people's lives. And I would say no. That fundamental to my approach is the idea that religions exist. There's no such a thing as, say, Buddhism or Hinduism that exists apart from the people practicing it at particular times and places. A friend of mine who is a political scientist once asked me what I thought the cash value of my ideas were, by which he meant, in a world that is concerned about religious violence and that's concerned about religion, how does that statement that religion exists in a world of friendship and kinship, not for the good, by the way. Friendship, kinship, these are very kind of warm and fuzzy terms, but I'm actually more interested in the ways in religion's potential for destruction on both political and intimate levels. Because once you look at religion on these levels and you see its implication in the sort of the grittiness of everyday life, you can't so easily say it's a force for good or a force for bad in any sort of simple way. But the answer to the question about the cash value of my ideas is that they should not have cash value. I want to resist. I really want to emphasize this because I feel like we're on the edge of something very important in the scholarship on religion in the United States right now. It should not have cash value for policymakers. It should not. And that should not be the agenda that drives our inquiries.
Professor Sen, would you prefer? We're going in alphabetical order, so I
think I'm going to take a later turn.
Okay.
I've been journeying for 25 hours so far. I just landed back from Calcutta, back via Bangkok, London, and the cash value of my ideas are minimal.
Welcome to the club.
Also, the day has gone on for 31 hours already, so there's some tension. But I'm trying to.
You deserve a break. Yes.
I already have things to say about Weber, but I'll come back to that.
Okay, Chris Winship.
Sure. So I think of myself as a methodological pluralist. I'm best known for work I've done in sort of high-tech statistical methods, at least high-tech by sociology standards, perhaps not by the standards of economics, on the application of those methods or use of those methods in studies of social inequality and race. Most of that work has nothing to do with religion. But for a number of years now, I've been involved in a very large qualitative study involving an examination of how a partnership between a group of black ministers, many of you probably have heard of here in Boston, called the 10-Point Coalition, and the Boston Police Department. And I guess my position is that as a methodological pluralist is that first, I think different methods are useful for different kinds of questions. I would make a claim, perhaps some of my colleagues here would dispute me, that I'm not sure that we could understand the distinctive nature of religion in the U.S., and particularly how it differs from religion in Western Europe, if we didn't have basic numbers on church attendance and belief that really show that the U.S. doesn't look like France. It doesn't look like England. It looks quite different. That said, certainly one of the things I've learned in my research on 10-Point is that qualitative research can be enormously useful at helping us understand how complicated the world is, what the underlying mechanisms that are going on. I'll talk a little bit later about how I think this partnership between 10-Point and Boston Police Department has been really fundamental in changing the nature of racial politics in Boston. Now, when Rachel introduced me, she did mention the fact that I'm also a member in the faculty at the Kennedy School. And so Bob's comments have sort of got me thinking. And I certainly agree with Bob that we don't want to necessarily have our research driven by the policy questions. On the other hand, I think as scholars we need to be enormously, as you do, enormously concerned about how policymakers use our research. And I think there's no possibility of us preventing them from using our research. And so the real question is kind of how do we create the right kinds of institutional structures, the right normative structures, so that research is used in appropriate ways. And I guess I would just say I think the situation in this country now, and this is not just about religion, it's about all research, is in pretty disastrous shape. I'm sure many people here realize that there's a large group of scientists that are protesting the White House's use of science and believe that they're just kind of making it up as they go and making up for whatever policies they want. And I suspect, one of the big challenges for the Academy in the next 20 years or so is going to be developing a healthy and productive relationship with policymakers.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
I would agree that the issue of how our work gets used is really fundamental, and it's a very pressing moral and political question. Can you help me understand what you mean by normative structures that might facilitate the conversation between academic inquiry and policymakers? What kinds of normative institutions or normative structure?
Well, sure. I'll give you a good example. I have been involved in a number of expert witness cases that have nothing to do with religion, involving class action suits involving gender and racial discrimination. These are suits that liability runs from about $100 million to about $2 billion. Seems to me that one of the principal norms of science, of scholarship more generally, is some notion of neutrality, even balance. We might say objectivity, though there's a complicated word.
Right.
If you look at what's going on these days in the courts, both sides are going out and hiring those experts who will say what they want. There is zero sense of, at least we'll put it in quotes, objectivity in what's happening.
Right.
And to me, that's an example where, society in some sense is undermining very core normative values of the academy. And, I think as scholars, we need to have conferences and discussions and write papers to say, what in the world can we do to keep the courts from essentially underlying this core set of principles? I think those issues show up all over the place, but that's a very nice, well-defined one.
Robert?
Well, I wanted to react to a couple of things that I heard. I was surprised that Anne seemed to be suggesting that we thought that religion should be located in the social sciences, which...
It's the wording of the question, as Bob then, further elaborated on.
What I think that I'm more about, or some of his work is more about, is actually convincing social scientists that religion is important, and that religion is something that social scientists ought to try to incorporate in their own work, because it's likely to be important for outcomes in terms of economics, politics, and so on. And I hope that the work of religion scholars helps as an input to that, but that doesn't mean I think of the work of religion scholars per se as being part of social science. It may or may not be, depending on what the case is. I should also say that I think it used to be true a long time ago that economists particularly took it as basic that religion was central to thinking about economics. That's certainly true if you read Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations. But it's not been so true for a long time. So, again, part of what we're trying to do, I think, is to convince more economists and other social scientists that Smith was right in that perspective and that it should be central. I can't resist reacting to Bob's use of the term cash value and saying that he hoped that his work had no cash value. Now, I think that what this means is something about predictive value. I don't know that it's particularly about cash, but it's absolutely central in economics, no doubt about it, that your theory and your results are supposed to have predictive value. And if that's not the case, then it's generally thought in that area that there's something wrong with the analysis. That's what I think about as positive analysis, where you can make statements like if something happens, something is going to result from that or respond to that. It may or may not have immediate or correct implications for policy. That would be a further step, which I was trying to describe as normative. But the first part of it, the analytical approach, the if-then thing, the positive analysis, the predictive value, certainly is absolutely central to anything that I think about.
Okay. After the second question, if you have comments or questions of your own, we'll be happy to take them. Okay, the second question. Poverty, income distribution, civil society, and economic development are concerns of religion scholars and economists. From your intellectual vantage point, how do religion and religiosity help to elucidate these issues? And I'll ask Amartya Sen to be the first responder.
Well, thank you. Well, I think the premises seem to me to be just right, that it is a matter of interest to religious scholars, these issues are, and to economists too. And I must say, with Robert, I also would question your thing about cash value question. But it seems to me, and I think as Robert rightly said, that it has to have some predictive power in order for it to be a theory of interest. And if it does have predictive power, well, it will have some use. And to say that, to try to work it in such a way that it has no use would be to eliminate the predictive.
That's not quite what I was saying. But
no, but it will have that. It will have the implication. With no cash value, that means no one can make any use of it. So, but I think I can see what you say, what you were arguing, that it's you don't want this to be serving the purpose of this thing. Now, we're now on to a question where the purpose being served, poverty, income distribution, etc., would be good thing to serve, I would have thought, generally. So here, any cash value would be quite important. Having said that, and let me make a parenthetical remark about Max Weber. And, I got interested when I was in school many years ago. And it's quite remarkable how Weber, I don't know how religious scholars or sociologists view him now, but from the point of view of somebody interested in empirical prediction, it's amazing how wrong he got things. And there was a systematic pattern. By the time the ink was dry on his book about Protestant ethics being the great thing, Catholic countries like Italy and France were growing much faster than Britain. And by the time the Bavarians adjusted it to Christianity in general, Japan was going much faster. And then they changed it into a certain type of features, and even in school we had to read why Japan and England were very similar to each other. So Japan was included in it. But by that time, the East Asian economies, Hong Kong, Singapore, and then later China and South Korea, of course, were growing much faster. So they had to then adjust the hypothesis to Confucianism being the right thing. They're Weberian in the sense that there's some religious school. But by the time that was settled, Thailand, which is a Buddhist country, was growing faster than some of these. And of course now there's complete free-for-all with India, a completely confused country with 82% Hindus, a Muslim president, a Sikh prime minister, a Christian leader of the political party, is also going reasonably fast. So I think the difficulty, I would have thought that there is some lesson here as to what not to do, why not to make a prediction which is on one variable analysis on religion. Now, I think the basic issue is this. I think it would be amazing if poverty, income distribution, civil society, and economic development were not affected by religion. But there's so many different forces that would come into the story. And I think it's also a question, ultimately, of our identity. And this comes up in all kinds of ways, even in the context of security discussions. And the whole idea, and if I have a problem with religious studies in the sense that I'm not having been ever a religious person. It does not speak to me in an inner way. There's an outer way it speaks to me. It's like I watch baseball, if I do sometimes, without knowing how it's played or why. But in terms of a empirical analysis, I can see that it would be interesting for me to know. Do the religious things make a difference to one's attitude, whether in economic development or about tolerance of violence or anything else? But the real difficulty here seems to me that a person has so many different identities. And the same person could be a Muslim, could be a Shia, could be politically liberal or socialist, could be professionally a sociologist, could be heterosexual, could think the gay, lesbian rights are very important, without any contradiction between any of them, and each of these will define the person, including maybe his belief that there are intelligent beings in outer space with whom it's extremely urgent to talk, preferably in English. So that characterizes him in kind of all kinds of ways, and each of these have relevance. So I would have thought the real question would be not what religion does, but in the contextual context of various things that you're looking at, what its additional contributions, one way or the other, might be. And this is an important issue, and this is not Rachel's question, this is not the question number 2. But when I get very upset when people talk about such issues about, and we had this terrible, at one stage, Islamophobia, arguing that, Islamic religion produces that. And then you get a peculiar reaction, saying, no, Islam is a religion of peace, and anyone who doesn't believe in it isn't a true Muslim. Now, the fact is that Islam is just one of one identity. There are many other identities that go with it. If you look Indian emperors, Akbar was one of the most tolerant emperors. Aurangzeb was a very narrow-minded emperor who, the difference isn't that one was less Muslim than the other, but that does not define you entirely. There are other attitudes to be looked at. So the empirical study that I have seen so far doesn't lead me to any kind of confidence yet, and that maybe there's some more studies which I haven't seen, that religion is a factor that has been properly isolated, taking into account the influences of other variables that would come into the story. So here I remain an agnostic. I would like to see that it works. It would be interesting to know. It would be amazing if it had no influence. But it would be amazing if it would be a dominant influence over everything else that makes a difference. And for one thing, we know that each country also, without changing its religion, changes its growth rate, changes its economic development pattern quite often. So my concern here is really to make the project more ambitious rather than less so, while drawing at the moment a cautious, tentative blank.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. I think your fellow panelists probably want to address this. Bob?
Well, speaking on behalf of religious studies here.
Which, Alvin, can I buttress him one, too, right after that?
I do want to say that it would be a caricature of religious studies to say a couple of things about it. No scholar of religion that I know would claim that religion is a sufficient variable for making sense of a social, political, economic world. That may have been a view that was held 25 years ago, but today that is simply not on the table. The discipline of religious studies understands the intricate, in fact, that's one of the reasons why the flattening out of the theoretical discourses of religion under the pressure of political agendas right now is so problematic. It's problematic for many reasons, but one of the reasons is that it misrepresents where we are right now in understanding religion as completely implicated in worlds of law, medicine, the connection between politics and religion, class and religion, demography and religion. I mean, that's what we do. That's what religious studies does, is it tracks those. And frankly, there is a genre emerging, and this is that genre that I worry about, that thinks that you can, for example, derive the sources of, quote, Islamic terrorism, and there is no such a thing as Islamic terrorism among any scholar that I know certainly would say that there's no such a thing as Islamic terrorism. You can't derive out of a kind of phenomenology of the Quran an account of a political movement, and no scholar of religion would say that today.
And I might add to that as well that while I would agree that with everything that Professor Orsi has said, much of the work currently coming out on religious identity and economic preference, including someone who's at the Weatherhead Center and in the economics department, Professor Charan Singh last year from the Reserve Bank of India, there's been a tremendous misuse of survey data in this regard that I think drastically needs to be corrected. So you look at the 2000 survey of India, which does track religious preference. It comes out that Jains tend to have a higher level of education than Christians. And Dr. Charan Singh analyzed that according to religious preference. But the fact of the matter is that without any kind of class analysis, without any kind of contextualization of religious identity in exactly the same kind of format that both Professors Orsi and Sen are talking about, that doesn't mean much. Christians come from what are called in Indian English the more depressed classes. They have less money. Less money means fewer educational attainments in India. Just to sort of, again, add to something that hasn't been brought up yet as well, is I think it's also worth positing, and again, I take issue with Professor Orsi about mischaracterizations of religious studies and what we're trying to do. One of the things that's also become very apparent even to august an economic institution as the World Bank is that religious organizations are some of the most successful at organizing grassroots, on-the-ground resistance campaigns to World Bank projects the world over, including India, which is the case I'm most familiar with. So there's a new interest in certain wings of the World Bank in figuring out what this is all about. And what it's all about is essential, and this is the question I would have really for Professor Sen, is whether or not you think taking religious discursive practice and ideas seriously can in any way or should in any way, or you can imagine any way, in which it would change the public discourse of economy and development. So, for example, is development always to mean simply economic growth? Are there other means of development? Many religious groups in India, for example, would suggest that there are other ways of considering development. And that, in my mind, is one place, this is, again, as far afield from 12th century South India as I could possibly get. But it seems to me to be one place where productive work needs to take place.
No, I entirely agree, of course, that development and growth are not the same thing. Mm-hmm. But, it's the thought that has occurred to non-religious people as well. I mean, it's not a kind of special thought of religious people only. So I think we are on the same side, even though it may be that one of us is religious and the other is not.
But this is let me just again say, this is another major misconstruction. I am a card-carrying member of the Happy Atheist Club myself, as are, I would say, a great.
I wasn't referring to you, sorry.
Yeah.
I was saying two persons, one may be, I'm delighted that you are a member.
But again, if we're going to talk about gulfs that separate us on this panel,
my point wasn't that. My point was that two persons could have, one person may get to it by religion, on ground saying that, we do know how much the religious commitment has been associated with good work being done in removing poverty and so on, even when you belong to a very secular organization. I used to be the president of Oxfam for 3 years. And I was struck how many of the volunteers who went out were moved by religious concerns. And then there were others who were not. What I'm saying is that it's quite possible that the same position, that mere growth is not what you're looking for, even though growth will be correlated with development in a very big way, I would have thought. But the fact that they're not the same thing and could make a big difference is something which you could arrive at on the basis of reasoning which are religious or which are not. And and I take it that you wouldn't dispute that. So I think in the Indian context, the contribution that's come on the subject of broadening growth, so I do think that the Indian context, that distinction is the value of that distinction, which I was very keen on 30 years ago. I think I would say that under the present circumstances, the world has changed. That distinction doesn't carry that much weight because it's increasingly clearer that in order to reach relatively very poor people, you do need a higher growth rate. Not need it, but it would make things much, much easier. But those critique that, after all, development is about human life, what kind of life you had, how long you live, whether you're educated, whether you have gender equity, etc. These are not the same thing as economic growth. But it's not clear to me that the breakthrough contributions here will actually come from religious thought. I think I would be very surprised if that were the case.
Well, we can agree to disagree then.
Yeah, you think it will come from there?
I think it's possible. I think what we have in the largely secular West is a dearth of understanding about the way issues like human flourishing are perceived in religious contexts in the communities we seek to help. I think that work needs to be done. I don't think we have enough research on that.
Yeah. And why is it that the West is so deficient in that respect?
Because the language of political economy, although rooted deeply in Protestant Christian values of the post-Enlightenment period, nonetheless proceeds as if it does not function on certain commitments to what human subjectivity means, the construction of selfhood, what choice means, what agency means. There are different ways of construing what agency is.
And you see a big West-East divide on that?
I don't see a big West-East divide, certainly, but I do see I would say, a gradation of choices, a gradation of different ways.
Because we are looking historically almost to every thought, one could find parallels in, if you look Chinese, Indian, Arabic.
Parallels
Japanese
at the level of intellectual elites, but we're talking about development aimed at actual communities of living people.
Yeah, but intellectual, I think there's one difficulty is that the East-West contrast often takes the form of Aristotle meets the Indian peasant
Yes, that is right. That's what I think needs to change.
You could ask
yes.
a similar question about what happens if, say, speaking about political economy and this attitude could have been what happens when Kautilya meets the Visigoth. It's exactly a similar question.
Same question.
And
class is
so,
there.
The class is there,
and we need to pay attention to that.
But if you can't say that it's the elite only in the East who perceive these, no. Because in the West too it was elitist, and if it spread from the elite, and that's the way that these ideas spread. So it's not clear. You're not convinced me, but I can see that Rachel wants to move on. So yes. I think we're going to talk this out another time.
Well, I wanted to see if the other panelists wanted to jump in, or if we can take some questions from the audience at this point. Robert?
I wanted to pick up on a couple other things that Amartya said. First, I didn't think it was completely fair to Max Weber. I thought Weber's thesis was that the Protestant Reformation was important to economic development in parts of Europe at a certain time in history, pre-industrial revolution, around the time of the Industrial Revolution. And I thought that Weber believed that this was no longer important later on, for example, in the 19th century. And he wouldn't have argued that the difference between Protestant and Catholic countries would be very significant there. He thought, as I read it, that these differences in beliefs were absorbed into other aspects of institutions and were no longer as important as they had been before. So I don't think he'd be surprised to find that in the modern data that you don't find a big difference, especially between Protestant and Catholic countries in terms of economic approach. But I was also struck by what Amartya and also Anne said about the business of whether they were personally religious or not. And Amartya seemed to indicate he was uncomfortable analyzing religion because he didn't have any identity with it.
Not at all. No.
That's it. Well,
I was putting my cards on the table.
The reason this struck me is that I find every time I give a seminar related to religion and how it impacts with economics, I always get a question from the audience about whether I'm religious or not. And I find that peculiar. I've drawn this parallel with my former colleague Gary Becker, who studies economics of crime. And when he talks... He tells me that when he gives a seminar, nobody ever asks him whether he's a criminal or not. And then the question is, why is religion somehow supposed to be different here? Now, part of this is on the question about whether you have to be a practitioner or a believer in order to really understand things enough to analyze them. But I think religion is important, whether or not I believe in it personally or not. I think it's an important part of, important at least input into social science and social science type questions, and that's what I'm trying to analyze. My sense was that Anne probably agreed with that, but I wasn't so sure about Amartya. The only other point I wanted to make, which is related to Amartya saying, religion is not going to be the single factor explaining something, and I, of course, agree 100% with that. I think religion may contribute something along with a lot of other factors to seeing something about economic results, and that's the kind of thing we're trying to analyze empirically. Anne's discussion, I think, about Sharon Singh's use of survey data in terms of the regions of India, I don't think that was really a problem about the data, the survey data. I think it was a problem with how it was being analyzed.
Yeah, it's the interpretation.
It's just looking at a correlation between education and religion, and that's not going to be too meaningful for at least two reasons. One is that other factors haven't been held constant. Anne seems to like the word class. I tend to think about things like levels of per capita income or life expectancy, which is more of a continuum, which I guess you could think about as class, but I don't think about it as usually as being sort of one group versus the other. And the other problem with the kind of analysis that Singh did was that, it didn't at all analyze the causation. It wasn't clear about religion influencing education versus the reverse. So there were those two kinds of problems, which I would agree with.
Yeah,
Can I respond to that?
Yes.
First of all, on Weber, when he was writing, it is the case. He looked around and he can see there were Protestant countries which were successful. To link the two wouldn't be much of a predictive theory yet. It becomes interesting only if it says something about the future, and then we check. The moment we apply that theory, and if you find that the prediction that you will get from, I do know that he puts in a lot of qualifications at the end, but if you're looking at the basic hypothesis about the contribution of Protestant ethics, if it is not just observing what he is seeing around him at that moment, and if it has no predictive component, I don't know what kind of a theory it is, for reasons that I thought you and I would agree on. And then if you take predictive thing, it's not just the problem about France and Italy, which is Britain, but it's also a problem with Japan and Hong Kong and Thailand and so forth. So that I think the main issue there isn't really even whether Protestant ethics itself plays this part or not, because the many Weberians are not a believer in that thesis. But they're a believer there is a quintessential way of characterizing a society in terms of its dominant religion, which will have that role on its own. That basically is the Weber thesis that one sees, and one sees in a kind of limited way in Tony and a number of others. I think that's what the dispute is about, it seems to me. But on the second issue, the religious thing, I think there are two things. I laid my cards on the table because sometimes I've spoken on that when people say, you're not religious, you would not. Religion is not like other things. It's something which you have to feel from inside. So if that may well be the case, I have no way of knowing whether that is the case or not. And therefore I was saying that if that is the case, perhaps I'm missing something. That was my reason. But I would say that I see no reason whatsoever why one has to be religious otherwise in order to study it. But I would say this thing, and I think the analogy with Becker doesn't really quite work, because Becker regards crime to be an important subject. Otherwise he wouldn't study it. People don't ask him whether he's a criminal, but the right question to ask, are you against crime? And by and large, I think given the fact that he's given a lot of time to it, I would tend to believe that he thinks that he is against crime. Now, I think you have to get the sign right in this context. And in the case of religion, there could be two interests. Either you might think that religion is such an important thing, and from a religious studies point of view, you might begin there, that it's something which we don't, as you pointed out, you don't want to be in the pay of policymakers. That I took to be the Cash statement. And I can fully understand that. You take an interest in religion. And then from there one could ask, does it have any other effect also? That becomes interesting because as a category it has interest. And then does this category apply to another domain? That could be one. Now that, I don't come in there because I'm not in that territory. And that's why I was also making, that's the second reason for that self-denying statement. But that would not prevent me from going into the third issue, namely, is it the case that, in fact, when we look at prediction of different countries, that religion actually ends up being quite interesting, is not intrinsically perhaps interesting, but it could become, in effect, causally, in a predictive model, extremely interesting. And for that, one wouldn't have to be religious to take a position one way or the other.
Well, let our sociologist have a say here. Chris?
Yeah, boy, so I better defend Weber there. Thanks, Bob. Weber is still required reading, mostly for theoretical reasons, though I think Bob's reading of Weber is a lot closer to how a sociologist reads him than a Marta's does. And it seems to me there are lots of social science theories that are not predictive. They're explanatory. Let me give you three in economics. Work on why the baby boom occurred during the 50s. Work on why female labor supply went up in the 60s and 70s. Work on why income equality went up in the 80s. These are all research agendas that are backwards looking and are attempting to explain why something happened. They're very context dependent. And I think, Bob very nicely explained the way in which Weber was trying to talk about the importance of Protestantism within a specific historical period and a particular set of countries, and involving a certain set of mechanisms that involved taking a set of values that were embedded in religion and having them become integrated into a different set of institutions. So if we're going to demand that scientific theories be predictive, about 80-90% of social science is going to get thrown out the door. Yeah.
It's not my position at all, by the way.
Well, but you said if it's not predictive, I'll quote you, I don't know what kind of theory it is.
I'm sorry, my point was what kind of... You're not quoting me fully. Yes. Any empirical proposition might have a lot of interests. It could have a predictive interest, it could have an explanatory interest, it could have an evaluative interest, it could have many other interests on which many of us have tried to write over the last 30 years. The question is that when a theory is presented, and this may not be Weber's fault, it could be Weberian rather than Weber, that when it's made to look that there is an explanation here which is not a particular sui generis statement about what had happened in Europe, but something from which people in other regions can learn something, then what it is a claim to a predictive theory, and to put it in terms of almost a tautology, that a predictive theory isn't a very good predictive theory if it doesn't make good predictions. Well, that was the statement I was making.
And I guess I would say that you offered really a caricature of Weber's theory. I don't think that's Weber.
I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree. I think any 6-line summary of a book will have that feature.
But it doesn't. I don't think his theory predicts that we shouldn't see lots of economic growth in Japan because it's not a Christian country.
Chris, would you say, though, can I just jump in here for a quick
question?
I mean, would you say, this whole conversation about Weber, I think it's worth distinguishing between sort of the kind of Weber that you and Robert are trying to construct, with which I would completely agree, and then what might be called, and has existed powerfully in several disciplines, as a kind of vulgar Weberianism, which has a kind of life of its own, and which is used in precisely the ways. We heard this. You can hear it still in even someone like Sam Huntington's account of Mexican-American Latino Catholicism. You hear echoes of what none of us would take as a kind of strict, good Weberian analysis, but which does fall under the category of the vulgar Weberian, right?
I agree.
Yeah.
I'd like to open up for questions and comments from the audience, if that's okay with the panelists. I think Gordon had his hand up first, and I'll try and be fair.
I've been somewhat surprised that in a cross-disciplinary discussion of as complicated a set of questions as religion involves, that nobody has bothered to tell us how they identify religion. How do they recognize it in their work? I think Ann Munoz came the nearest to that by talking about problems of meaning, but obviously not all kinds of meaning or religious meanings and so on, so we really haven't got it focused yet. But I don't believe anybody has stated a hypothesis or whatever it might be on what we're trying to talk about when we're talking about religion and how one would identify it. And for this reason, we're jumping all over the map, going in all kinds of directions without noticing even within the crossing borders.
Panelists?
I'd like to hear each speaker on that point.
Can we go alphabetically? Robert, go ahead.
I know there have been lots of attempts to come up with a definition of religion, and I guess in some logical sense you might want to start with that, but then I'm not sure it actually ends up being the most effective way to proceed.
When you say a definition, how do you recognize it? How do you identify it? How do you pick it out of all the other kinds of social phenomena, cultural phenomena, and so on that you're looking at?
The thing that matters in the kind of analysis I was summarizing at the beginning was something about individual traits and values. I mentioned things like work ethic and honesty and so on. So if religion somehow underlies that, then it's not necessarily going to be something involving supernatural belief, which is often mentioned as part of a definition. It's not necessarily going to be something about believing in one God or a benevolent God, and it's not necessarily going to involve a role for an afterlife or belief in an afterlife. question came up the other day about whether we should treat communism as a form of religion, some kind of a value system. I responded that in some sense you could think about it that way, but in terms of the underlying values and characteristics that mattered in terms of the results related to economic outcomes, I thought that communism was going to end up having adverse effects, whereas the more standard forms of religion, at least in some circumstances, seem to have positive effects. So in terms of quantifying, of course, I was thinking of religion in terms of a set of beliefs and in terms of participation in some kind of formal structures. And in terms of adherence, I was using the kind of the normal kinds of classifications of religion. But in terms of a more basic definition, I think you run into the kinds of problems that I was just going through.
Anne?
This is actually question 3, Professor Kaufman, and I think tells you something about, I think if Bob and I had done the questions, it might have been number 1. But anyway, since we are in the study of religion, I would say, first of all, that this has been much debated in my field since 17th century Jesuits tried to determine where religion ended and culture began over the issue of conversion and caste. Is caste a religious element, and therefore when people convert, they must give up caste seating in pews in church? Or if it is merely cultural, then they can maintain caste identity when they convert to Catholicism. I have a very loose, weak definition, you might say, that it is some kind of sustained, within the cultural sphere I work on, a sustained orientation towards something valuable beyond the quotidian everyday that is both consistently thought about, theorized within the cultural tradition, and also enacted in some performative way.
This is a trap I'm not falling into.
You can pass.
A good way to just ruin a class is to ask this question. In part because I think, Gordon, the way the question has been asked, you asked a question almost, maybe this is unfair, but let me just say the question is often asked as a philosophical question, as if we could come up with a kind of a priori definition of religion and moved immediately to the historical. And I would say, and this perhaps could help you out when you're asking, this is where religious studies might kick in as a useful discipline with some cash value. And that is that I think nowadays we recognize that we have to use the word religion with tremendous self-consciousness and self-reflexivity about the history of the word. Its evolution in a set of Western discourses over the last several centuries, and then with more of a prehistory than that. And I think now we're very reticent to come up with sort of deontological sort of accounts of what this is religion, and we could use this to talk about it around the world.
Yeah, we do.
Some of us don't.
Amartya?
Well, I agree with Bob, actually, that I think it could be a trap. But let me, not a consciously laid trap, but...
No, Gordon. Not a consciously laid trap.
It's a little hole into which you can fall and disappear without trace. But I would say that in any kind of empirical... you can ask that, you're talking about empirical things, whether a predictive theory, and I do emphasize, I do believe there are many other theories which are not, and very important theories, which are not predictive. But for any of those work, you would like to be able to have categories that you could identify. So I think that's not it's a legitimate question from that point of view. I don't think you will end up getting one answer to that. There's one answer that you will get, which is kind of senseless definition answer. The guy goes around and asks, what's your religion? For a while in India, you couldn't ask that question because they thought to be divisive, and it was taken out. I'm not sure what the present position is. It's changed from time to time on that subject. It's an interesting question. But there is a self-description thing. I say I'm a Christian, I say I'm a Hindu, I say I'm a Muslim, etc. Second is that a person identified their beliefs, and you talk about what their beliefs are and how do they correspond. Saying basically you are not, you say this, but you're not really. There's a question that often comes up. again, in the Indian context, lots of Parsis, who were formally Zoroastrian, but in fact, if you look at the beliefs today, quite often they don't really correspond to that. So can you describe them as Zoroastrian or not? That's another tension. And third, and I think which Bob also in an earlier answer, in the earlier context, in fact, just when I came in, was explaining that you have to think about what people's practices are and not just their ideas, how do they behave. So that's another way. And there are big differences. I mean, Indonesia is the largest Muslim country in the world. I think there are many more Muslims in India who pray regularly than in Indonesia, because of the fact that even though Indonesia is the largest Muslim country, India is the third largest, just behind Pakistan, with 135 million people. Most of Indian Muslims actually have practices of the kind that substantial parts of Indonesia, I understand, does not actually observe. I'm not an expert enough to I'm just quoting what I've read on that subject, and one could then raise the question: are there more Muslims in Pakistan or India than there is in Indonesia? But that would be more in terms of the practice, how they conduct their life, and then of course it also changes once Islam becomes a big issue in the political context. Then people may identify in a way they didn't. When I was Master of Trinity, I remember trying to chat with students, welcoming them in matriculation dinner, who had tremendously strong food restrictions. And I asked, what did your parents do? I gathered from her that her parents are both doctors, both, of course, Muslim. And she said, oh, well, no, they don't follow any of these rules at all. So you may find a situation when actually generation to generation. And she took the view that the parents made a mistake, that they were not following their own culture. So I think you will get definable answers, but I don't think they will be exactly the same definition. And your question, its importance lies in saying that it would be important, it's very relevant to distinguish between the kind of empirical studies we do, which of these definitions we are using. So in that sense, I do welcome that question.
I wasn't looking for a single definition.
No, okay.
But doing their work.
But that's the way, and I hope you agree that would be one way of answering the question.
Yeah, thank you. Chris?
Well, I think I agree with what's been said. I don't see that there's much productive in trying to come with a precise analytic definition of what religion is. It seems to me that having it be a fuzzy definition, I don't have any problems with Anne. There's certainly a lot of others we can come up, and seeing those definitions as provisional is useful. And then the usefulness, in some sense, is judged by taking various theories analysis and seeing, if we study Protestantism in 17th century England, and then we go to 20th century India and look at Islam or something, are we coming up with the same kinds of theories, the same kinds of methods, sort of useful? And if the answer is yes, then that loose definition is helpful. If the answer is we need sort of a totally different way of thinking about things because we've changed time periods or changed locations or whatever, then we need to have a different definition. Now, I think part of what's going on here is that in sociology we make a distinction between analytic categories and categories of practice. So analytic categories are the categories as scholars that we use to try to understand the world. Now, it is also the case that everyday people all around the world talk about religion. We go to the White House, George Bush talks about religion. That's religion being used as a category of practice. And I think as scholars, there's an enormous amount for us to say for trying to understand how religion as a category of practice is used at different times and places. And for instance, what are the political implications today in the U.S. that George Bush versus other people are using the category of religion in different ways? is part of their political practice.
I'm not sure he uses the word, but he uses faith and Christianity.
Well, yeah, okay, yeah. Those would also be categories of practice. But
very quick response.
Just a response to something that Amartya said. If you look at the World Values Survey, they certainly ask questions to people, including in India, about what religion do you consider yourself an adherent of. So there's no embarrassment about asking that question. What I did find interesting in that survey, it has 13 predominantly Muslim countries, which didn't used to be included. And the question they don't ask in the Muslim countries is, what religion did you grow up in? As though admitting the possibility that it might be something different from what you're currently practicing. So that question, which was asked for other countries, was omitted in the survey for the Muslim countries. There are also data there for most of the countries on how often do you spend time at prayer. So we could certainly compare the Muslims in Indonesia with those in India. I have the data at home, but I don't remember what the numbers are.
Emily? Oh, okay. There's.
I had a question maybe from Professor Orsi and Monius, and it's about your reluctance to engage in the policy arena, or to have your work be used functionally towards ends you may not approve of. And I can understand in this climate that you don't like political aims of the current administration, hypothetically, and therefore you don't trust the integrity of those who wield your findings. But it seems to me that part of your project is this sort of countercultural complexifying how we understand human thriving and human flourishing. And so actually what you're doing is attempting to provide resources for helping society at large reevaluate how we help people live healthy, full lives. And I wondered that isn't there a tension in your withholding your findings, but presenting the poor definitions being used by, say, the World Bank in how they define thriving, or are you just reluctant to trust the institutions as they currently exist?
Well, I would say my own experience of this is fairly limited. I had a run-in with the World Bank Interfaith Dialogue unit twice over the summer. And the issue, I think, to paraphrase more carefully what I heard you say, Bob, was about the way in which policy decisions and the ultimate outcome is geared toward those policy decisions. So, for example, it's one thing to sort of set out to understand traditional Hindu notions of agency. Apply for a grant, go figure that out. It's another one to apply for such a grant from Human Rights Watch with the idea of trying to somehow learn how to educate Hindus to think about agency and selfhood in a different manner. So that's a very different attitude. There's no doubt that certainly I think all of us teach because, we see the effectiveness of what we do sort of one student at a time who goes out and does various things. Again, I won't speak for Professor Orsi. But there is a certain shift in the current global economic climate, I think, toward wanting us. And, for someone like me who labors in the 12th century, cash value zero all the way, until fairly recently, where people have really wanted to know, so what do I think gears Hindu fundamentalism? Is it something that's been present in the Hindu tradition since, the beginning? Those kinds of things, at least for me, I think probably not for Professor Orsi during American religious history, are very new demands on my kind of scholarship and work, and ones that, again, I would simply echo what Bob said, very frightening.
Okay, and then I'll get to you.
In the general sense of the words, in the etymological sense, if religion informs and is an expression of what is the spiritual nature of humankind, what do you think the possibility of a universal perception of spiritual unity would contribute to the survival of humankind?
My answer, if I can go first.
Yeah.
I think the answer the way I would respond to your question, I think would be somewhat boring, but I think it might be useful to illustrate what I've been trying to say about religious studies in its current practice, and that is that I think I would really have to sit down with you, and we would have to spend some time talking about the history and destiny and trajectory of the word spiritual, and the way spiritual has been used in different political contexts and in certain environments in Western intellectual history and so forth. Now, I realize that the more I talk, the more boring it gets, because it doesn't have the grandeur that the word spiritual. But I actually think that if there is a kind of moral, and to get back to Maura's question, political impulse in the discipline, it is precisely in the kind of relentless critiquing of the history of these kinds of words, which have been used in very complicated ways. There are these like in American psychology, pedagogical psychology, there are these models of spiritual development, which are completely normativized, in which you go from 1 to 6. These present themselves as value-neutral accounts of human development. But, you go kind of from Catholics to Unitarians in those developments, with Catholics being at a lower end, Unitarians being at the higher end. And spiritual is a tag that's attached to certain ways of being in the world. So I would say that we need to really break that down.
Bill.
I guess I'll address this most specifically to Robert Barrow, even though we can't see each other. I'll lob you a question. The sort of checking in on what this is all about, this discussion, and the project out of which it comes, is all about. I understand the importance of Gordon Kaufman's observation, and certainly its implication that one's definition of what he or she is talking about in this kind of analysis becomes very important. However, it seems to me the starting point here is what I, as a historian, would call a very importantly historical situation and situation in the sociology of history and sociology of knowledge, in which they, in a sense, what you mean by the religion you're talking about is initially, anyway, kind of irrelevant, because the era of social science and positivism, or positivistic social science, that I think, and economics and so forth, that Robert was and the project are referring to, have a history, and a very important history, and significant history of saying religion is unimportant no matter what your definition is. That it's all nonsense. That may sound like an exaggeration. Well, go to the experience of the Partisan Review in the end of the 1930s, trying to get the scholars together to comment on religion, and it couldn't get any. And 10 or 15 years after the war, there's an important, I think, two issues of the Partisan Review, in which the result of it not having been difficult at all. There had been some change in the tide, and I think we're talking about, initially, a situation that has lasted, and that many of us are acquainted with, maybe even somewhat a part of, in our academic institutions and in our scholarship and social science and humanities in the very recent period that we've been part of, but in which that was still the case. That the R word, just as you don't ask, what do you mean by liberalism when you reject the L word or its reality. But that's an important datum to start with, and I thought that was very much the starting point of this discussion.
Well, why don't we start with Robert Barrow, to whom the question was directed? But I see Bob Orsi and... No? No, okay.
It was directed at you. You got it.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Well, I think what Bill says is fair in many ways. Particularly until recently, I think many economists, other social scientists really would basically be regarded as not respectable to try to incorporate religion into your economic study. It was something that I think would be regarded as a suspicion from that point of view. But certainly it wasn't always true in economics. But the fact that one has to go back more than 200 years to Adam Smith suggests that there's been a long interval where it wasn't certainly viewed as important. On the other side, I think it's also true that religion scholars have a tendency more recently to regard economists, social scientists who are interested in this topic as kind of trespassing on what they do. So that means if you're trying to study economics in relation to religion, you sort of get it from both sides. Because a lot of the economists also don't think it's such a great idea. But that has changed a good deal, I would say, particularly in the last 5 years or so. There are really a lot more in the way of economists who are interested in this topic and are actually trying to study religion in the context of what they're interested in economics, even in terms of financial markets, economic growth, labor behavior, various topics. So I think it is changing a lot.
Did any of you want to address that or no? Okay. One last question.
I'd like some state to come into, no, not necessarily now, but when the question was asked earlier about, I think what is one of the central issues, namely the question of payoff, which came up. I think I would like to make something on that. But
okay, can we take one question and then get back to that?
Yeah, sure.
Yes, my question is about the role of class in study of religion. There's been a panel discussion entitled Economic Class and Religion. There's been a very little data about that, except Robert Barrow did some of the degree that there's succeeding with more sort of linear distribution, resources, and what have you. So I would like to hear about what you think the role of classes in the study of religion. Particularly since to the extent it's been discussed, class has been discussed in very what is it called, the relationship between class and religion. And it hasn't really been discussed whether perhaps there might be an articulation between class and religion as different ways of organizing groups.
Anne, do you want to start with that?
Sure. I'll start with that. I mean, certainly within my own realm of religious studies, that it's a woefully understudied, under-researched area of inquiry that needs much further attention than it has ever gotten. As a historian, we simply don't have access to that kind of material, but as I was suggesting earlier, that particularly in the case of South Asia, where there are very complex identities, not that there aren't everywhere, where social location includes religious identity, gender identity, caste identity, class identity, which is increasingly changing traditional caste identities in various ways, etc. There is simply no good anthropological or sociological research from South Asia right now that really focuses on the way in which those particular kinds of identities merge and manifest themselves in human behaviors in the way that an individual doesn't go through, okay, I'm a middle-class person today and I'm a Hindu 5 minutes from now. We just don't have the research. I think it desperately needs to be done.
Yeah, Chris?
We have a long tradition of sociology, certainly looking at the relationship between religion and class. And I would just start by pointing to all the work that's been done on studying the WASP elite, which by definition in part is about religion. It's not just Protestants, Episcopals, and so on. I think the interesting question, at least for sociologists, is not just noticing that at various points in time religion and class tend to come together, but trying to understand when that occurs and why and what are the consequences of it. What does it mean to live in a society in which class is in part coded through religion? And, in the United States, there's certainly been many people who have argued that one of the reasons class has never been an important category of practice within the U.S. is precisely so much of the intergroup stuff has been coded and done through the categories of religion as opposed to the categories of class.
Mm-hmm. Bob, did you want to? Okay. Okay, why don't we take one more question?
First of all, I'd like to thank Professor Noyes for bringing this into a global context. My question is directed for both Professor Noyes and Professor Barrow. I've done some research into sort of marketing theory, recent marketing theory, and a lot of it talks about major shifts in patterns of consumption from efficiency and products from that model to branding logic, which basically means more or less meaning construction. How do religion or sort of the humanities perspective on the sacred and rational choice theory look at the sacred differently, and how does that affect how we think of sort of globalization?
Do you want to start? Okay. Well, one of the things I would say is I would characterize that as something of a misrepresentation to say that religious studies in its current practices is focused on the sacred, and I very carefully avoided any mention of that in my sort of loose definition of how I think I recognize religion when I see it in a text or in cultural practice. And I think that, again, what, if anything, where we can agree on perhaps in this panel is that maybe there's nothing, maybe it's just the clash of civilizations here, but one of the things that we might be able to agree upon is that particularly, and again, I wish somebody would ask me about 12th century South India, I could speak with some authority here, but that I think we're probably on agreement that the kind of work that needs to be done to think about in productive, even, God forbid I say this, predictive theoretical models, about the ways in which consumption, religious preference, outlook work, not just in survey data, but actual on the ground, agentive choices made by individuals, by corporate individuals, communities, etc. I think that work needs to be done. I don't think it has been done. Certainly not in my field, which is all I'll speak to. So the answer is, I don't know.
Amartya, would you like to
address that question in particular? I think I think I agree with what was said. So I don't think other than when she said, I don't know, because she gave some evidence she did know. And I agree with that bit.
All I have is intuitions based on my own experience.
Yeah. The point is that if it is the case that, to look at it another way, if it's the case that each person has a variety of identities, the influences on this behavior would come from different directions. And they need not be monotonic in the sense that every one of them has a positive or a negative sign throughout. It may depend on the value of the other variables involved. So it's a complex question. It's an extremely important question in the past, historically, as well as today. So I very much agree with what you said there.
Would you like to give your comments on cash?
On what?
What was it?
On the cash? No, well, the cash, and actually, I don't think cash is what Bob was talking about. The central issue seems to be this, that it would be amazing if religion wasn't an important factor in economic behavior, social behavior, as well as other kinds of civic behavior. It would be totally amazing. And if economists have not been interested in the past, it's not to their credit. But there's such a long list of things that are not to their credit that one doesn't know where to begin. I was very impressed that you regarded that mistakes of economists were some kind of justification for sociologists to go in that direction, because I wouldn't regard that to be a great standard. But religion is clearly important. It's clearly not the only influence. It's clearly interactive with other issues, and clearly the whole question of in my judgment, the whole issue of identity has to be recharacterized in a big way. Having said that, then the question arises, well, if these are important, then they will have clearly practical uses. Prediction, deeper explanation, evaluation, all kinds of different ways. We agree that these are the case. So what's the tension? I think the tension arises from two sides. One is what I think Bob was immediately referring to, namely that he doesn't want to be in a situation when the nature of the inquiry is being, as it were, subverted by policy priorities. And we have seen that happen in all kinds of fields. And that is a real danger for not just this subject, academic work generally. And I was pleased that Bob spoke up on that. Once we have redefined the language from cash to that, that's one thing. And secondly, I think it is the question that even if you're not influenced deeply by the policy priorities of the administration or whoever it might be, there's also the question of what use is put to your work. Now, I was successful in making negative remarks about Weber because it had the effect of irritating people all around me. And I was 100% successful. But the main thing to talk about, and since I have spelled it out in my book, I can say that that's not an invented position today. It's not really what Weber himself said, but it's the way the Weberian analysis has been used. You mentioned about Huntington, I think, or did you mention? But it's not just the religion. I mean, if you look at Huntington's analysis in this book, jointly authored with somebody else called Culture Matters, when he's comparing Korea with Ghana, points out that Korea and Ghana had the same per capita income in early 60s or whatever it was, and look at what the difference is. And all that is because the Koreans valued hard work and they had a culture of discipline. Ghanaians had different values, quote unquote. I'm quoting from there. And I think that is pretty upsetting. We know that Korea already was well on the way to a universal schooling program by then. We know that the business classes were extremely active in government in Korea, and they were keen on having a capitalist boom in a way. Ghana, it wasn't. So to drop all that and to get into a kind of single factor explanation which completely overlooks it, it's a danger. Even if you're not yourself influenced, we have to ask the question, and don't blame Weber for not asking that question, how your work would be used. But I think if people show some reluctance about that and to take it with some circumspection, I think that's right, because there is a need for circumspection, but it does not go against, I think, which was, I've forgotten who was, I think you asked the question, your motivational question, that if these are important, why shouldn't they be practically influential? They should be. I mean, if you take Anne's work on fundamentalism, I think we would like to know what the source of Hindu fundamentalism is. We know that there are different types of Hindu scriptures, beginning from straightforward atheism.
We'll need another panel for the sources of. We'll need another panel for the sources of Hindu fundamentalism.
But there's a whole lot of questions, and if they're properly identified, this would be interesting to know, not just for the government, but for a citizen of India, or for that matter, a citizen of the world who is interested in what's happening in this country. So I think your question is rightly motivated, but I'm trying to explain why the hesitation arises, and there are genuine reasons, I think.
Well, I think we have to call it quits right now, but you can join the panelists at a reception in the Brown Room with some tea, coffee, and some nice goodies to eat. Join me in thanking them for a stimulating panel.